All right. Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. My name is Dan Bromberg. I'm the Director of Academic Programs for the Carsey School of Public Policy and an Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science. We're thrilled to have you here this morning. For those of you that join us regularly, you know that this is a monthly conversation that we hold on the second Wednesday of every month. And we're really excited about our two guests this morning. We're joined today by Professors Dante Scala and Professor Andy Smith. And I'll give a brief introduction of both of them, and thank you both for coming, and I'll let them say a little bit more about themselves if they'd like. Professor Scala is a political science professor at the University of New Hampshire. He's been an observer of the New Hampshire politics for more than 2 decades and has written 2 books on the Granite State and the presidential nomination process, as well as numerous shorter works. So Dante, we're thrilled that you're here with us this morning. Thanks so much for taking time out of your day to do this. Professor Smith, Dr. Andy Smith, is the director of the UNH Survey Center. He has more than 35 years experience in academic survey research and has been the director of the Survey Center since 1999. We are thrilled to have both of them with us. Last month, our conversation took place the day after the election. So we decided we'd give them a month to actually think about this as opposed to hammering them the day after. So gentlemen, we're thrilled that you guys are here. We're really looking forward to this conversation. For all of you out there, who are joining us today, just keep in mind that there's a Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen right there. If you drop questions into that Q&A feature, I'll pose them to our 2 panelists throughout. We're going to hold today's conversation really without much of a presentation, more of just a conversation with both Andy and with Dante. So we'd love for you to join in. We'll anticipate that we'll run this for about 45 minutes to an hour or so. So I will get us kicked off with some questions. If you two want to jump in and just, maybe give a brief introduction of yourself or anything along those lines, that works too. So let me just start off with kind of a general question. Before we get to the results of the election, or thinking about the future, the implications that we just, that might come from this election, I'm wondering if you two could kind of just talk about what you think about prior to an election. What are you looking for prior to an election? Are there any indicators, that you think about, before we even get going? And maybe Andy, we could start with you. How far out do you start thinking about this stuff? And maybe you could just jump in. And if you want to say a couple words about yourself before you get going too, that works for me as well.
Well, sure. So I'm a pollster. I do public opinion research and look at elections, but more than anything, when you look further out in elections, trying to figure out what's likely to happen, I look at some really basic fundamental things, like what type of election is it? Is it a presidential election or a midterm election? Is there an incumbent running for president? In the local races or state races, are there incumbents running or non-incumbents? Are there divisive party primaries that are likely to happen? So those are the kind of the things that I look at first, then getting down to that, the state of the economy in general, because that impacts support for the president's party. And then looking at, just if there are any recent scandals or anything like that that are dominating the news narrative. So those are the things that I would look at before we even really know who the candidates are in many of the races.
Cool, thank you. Dante, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm a political scientist who studies campaigns and elections. So I look at polling to be sure, but it's one of a number of things that I'll try and check out before the election season starts. I don't know about you, Andy, but one thing that the last decade has taught me is to try to check all my preconceptions at the door and take the numbers for what they are, even if they don't seem to make much sense to me. And so I looked at Don Baldock's numbers and I said, a lot of people in the Republican Party know who Don Baldock is, which struck me as interesting because here was a failed candidate who said, I'm going to run next time around. And a lot of candidates say things like that, and then they disappear. But Don Baldock clearly hadn't disappeared. And what was more, people who knew who Don Bolduc was liked him. You know, they had a favorable opinion of him, not an unfavorable opinion. So all that struck me as like, Don Bolduc seems to be the one to beat for the Republican nomination, which on the face of it didn't make a lot of sense because it was pretty clear by then that he was going to be running against the state Senate president, Chuck Morris. And it was also pretty clear that a lot of Republican elites in New Hampshire didn't think much of Don Bolduc. But again, Andy, if we've learned anything over the last decade, it's that what elites think doesn't really matter a whole lot when it comes to primaries. So that was, it was striking early. You kind of look for those things, Dan, that might be a surprise, and you try to focus in on them and see how they turn out.
Yeah, to your point, Dante, about primaries, I think that's really important. The Democratic Party in New Hampshire has really done a good job of discouraging primaries. So they pretty much identify people for top offices early on, so they don't get that division within the party during the primary season. And it saves them a lot of money as well. And also it provides them, it keeps things such that as happened with Bolduc, being identified as on the fringe of the party by party elites. So that dynamic between the grassroots of the party and the party elites doesn't seem to come up as often within the Democratic Party as it had within the Republican Party in recent years. And that's a real weakness of any candidate coming into an election, is having to go through that sort of a bruising primary.
What's striking to me, Andy, thinking back, we both got to New Hampshire around the same time, right? 1999. This thing about Democrats back then to Democrats now, right? Democrats back then were they were the lovable losers. They were the scrappy underdogs, and they were trying to reach some kind of parity, equality with the Republican Party, which was dominant. And they had some success, right? Gene Shaheen as governor, for example, but they were still pretty clearly underdogs going in to any cycle. And now, it's no offense to any Democrats out there, it's striking how boring they've become, in the sense that, right, they don't have primaries, right, at least for major office, right? It's been a long time since we've seen any kind of competitive primaries. And they just are very, they're disciplined, and they run their candidates. And meanwhile, on the Republican side, to me, the most fascinating part of this past cycle were the Republican primaries, because they've become such a free-for-all in the wake of Donald Trump. And you see these candidates, Don Bolduc, defeating a state Senate president for the nomination. Sure, why not? 24-year-old runs for Congress, becomes the nominee. Sure, why not? It's really, as opposed to general elections, which, usually roll out in a particular way, the primaries could have gone any number of different ways. And that to me it's just fascinating to see where the New Hampshire Republican Party is at this point in time. You've got Chris Sununu, and you can kind of count on him. But other than that, it's really up for grabs.
To that point, I think this started probably about the time that we got here, where the two parties were becoming close to parity in electoral success, or their ability to win elections. Because since 1996, the Republicans have only won, there's only two Republicans who've been elected governor. And there's been, with the exclusion of the 2000 presidential election, which if you added the Nader votes in there to the Gore side, Democrats would have won there. They've won every presidential election here. So in the presidential years, Democrats certainly are not only on par with Republicans, they're beyond that. And that's, I think, really started in the late 1990s. So we've seen a realignment, a partisan realignment in the state of New Hampshire. But those things are slow. So we kind of have gone through that balance point in the early part of the 2000 aughts, but really since 2010 or so, after the Tea Party movement, which I think is part of the reason the Republican Party can't unify anymore. Since then, the Republican Party has certainly been much more disorganized and unable to a line behind a particular candidate. When they do, like a Sununu, then they win. When they are unable to get behind somebody and they see those divisions like we saw with the Baltic or the first and second CD races, they don't win.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump in. I'm going to jump in
go
for a sec here. There's a question of whether you two need a moderator at all right now. I may shift to just yes and no answers and see if I could rein you two in. So just getting back to kind of bigger picture, getting out of the weeds for a second, and we'll get back into those weeds. I know that's where you two really come alive. So thinking about kind of New Hampshire, thinking about midterm first general, kind of thinking about some of these key indicators that you guys have just mentioned. Are these unique to a New Hampshire context, or are these things that, are these specific idiosyncrasies that we see, or are there any specifically that we see in New Hampshire? Or are these really things that are happening across the country? Every state, is kind of thinking about these various components. What are your thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Dante.
I mean, New Hampshire is not an island, right? And so I think in a general election season, I keep one eye on national trends and one eye on what's happening in New Hampshire. There were some things that were peculiar to New Hampshire this cycle, but overall, I mean, I think, we were all watching this in October, November for the so-called red wave, and trying to figure out whether there was as Nate Silver would put it, whether there was a signal here amidst all the noise that you heard about, whether Republicans were making a big, we're going to finally kind of get their act together, make a big play, win back the House and the Senate and so forth. So you watch those national trends because, I mean, Andy's recitation of the facts about the Republican Party for the last quarter century are all true. I still think of us as a swing state, although we're clearly one with a Democratic lean to it. And what's happened in midterms for the past couple of decades has been that as a swing state, we tend to swing rather violently against the party in power. And this cycle in particular was, again, you can look back at the electoral history and that's helpful, but sometimes it's not, because this really was a throwback to 2002, which was the last time the party in power did well in New Hampshire. And by that, I mean the party in charge of the presidency, that they did well in a midterm election. And so it was really a throwback to 2 decades ago. And it was surprising to me how well Democrats held up in what should have been an adverse political environment.
So, Andy, I'll jump in just super quick because, I'm curious then, in thinking about the results and what we did see, does that change, your thinking as to, okay, well, what's driving to the people to the polls, and Andy in particular, when I think about, some of your thinking, and we've had these conversations kind of, well, there's historical precedent. This is typically the way things happen. And to some degree, you could count on things happening that way. And that's based on patterns that have been happening, for quite some time. When you then see what happens at the polls, does that lead you to conclusions to, well, this is actually what's driving people to vote as opposed to, or potentially not vote?
Well, first of all, I think we have to remember that when we're looking at the differences between winning larger majorities or losing majorities in electoral bodies, you're talking about a few percentage points in the vote margins here and there, and certainly a few percentage points in turnout differences. So it's not like the things that we're talking about, these differences are huge, seismic sort of political shifts of 10, 15 percentage points, usually in the range of 3 to 5 percentage points, but they can make big differences when you start to add up the number of seats. As far as driving people to the polls, what was really unusual this time, and this is something that we can talk about later on, but the ability, the the messages were driving the parties quite differently. If you looked at Republicans and Republicans, 39% of Republicans said the most important issue that was making them vote was the economy, cost of living, inflation, those sorts of things. And then another 35% said they wanted to get rid of Democrats. So the standard sort of thing, voting against the other guy. For independents, it was fairly similar. You saw 23% said about the economy. But then you saw within those as independents, and these are not the undeclared voters in New Hampshire. These are people who are truly nonpartisan or more nonpartisan. 23%.
Andy, can I ask you just to clarify that super quick? Because I don't know that our audience understands the difference oftentimes.
We have a myth in New Hampshire that we have a bunch of independent thinking voters because we have this category called undeclared when you when you vote or when you register to vote. And about 40% or so of our voters in the state are registered undeclared. But the great majority of those, about 2/3 of those people, are really Republicans or Democrats in their heads and their voting patterns. So this idea that we've got this big block of independents, I think, is just a real myth in New Hampshire. But for Democrats and the independents, the most important issue, or one of the most important issues, was abortion, women's rights, and certainly to vote against Donald Trump, the MAGA sort of stuff. So you had people being motivated by very different things. Historically, economic issues are the things that motivate people to the polls, that go to the polls the most. And that certainly wasn't the case this year for Democrats.
Excellent, thanks. Dante, anything that you would want to add to that?
I think we finally found out a way to keep Dante from talking to us.
That's great. All right, so this independent versus undeclared, you kind of clarified and covered. There's a question coming in from the audience related to whether or not there's actually space in New Hampshire for whether it be a third party or an independent party. I mean, is there a path through that independent space in New Hampshire for someone to have a victory, or is that just not really in the cards?
I don't think so. If you think of the candidates who have won or are elected in our national offices as independents or even in state offices, they typically were either people that were well known as members of one party, and then they went to independent. So you can think of most recently Kristen Sinema in Arizona. Or there are people that were just like well-known celebrities. So you think of Maine with Angus King in Maine, who was a news director, a TV guy for years and years and years before he ran for office. But everybody kind of knew he was a Democrat as well. I don't see the room for a party to win. There are individuals who can win, but I don't see the room for the creation of the parties. Our political parties are too amorphous and have such ability to rein in the political energy that's out there that I don't think we're going to likely to see a new party form anywhere in the country.
And just a reminder to the folks out there, I've seen a couple hands shoot up. If you could just drop your questions into the Q&A on the bottom of your screen, that's the best way for us to feed them to the panelists. So thinking about the results in New Hampshire, we obviously had a Republican governor win, an incumbent win. We actually had all of our incumbents win as far as our congressional races at the federal level and our one Senate race. Could you talk about this a little bit as far as this split ticket with Sununu holding office as governor, and then the Dems taking the other statewide offices? I mean, I guess a couple questions related to that. Is this common? Are we seeing this across the country in other states, or are we an outlier? Second question related to that is this just due to incumbency, which we often hear? Once you get into office, it's much easier to stay in office than it is to have someone from the outside take that seat. What is this telling us? Is this telling us anything? And Dante, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think, in some ways you can compare Chris Sununu's success to, it's not unprecedented. You can look back now a couple decades to John Lynch, right? Democratic governor, elected in 2004, was elected and reelected in good Democratic years and bad Democratic years, Sununu is really kind of looks like maybe he'll go after Lynch's record in terms of consecutive terms as governor. It's so that's not, so Sununu in some ways is the, Republican equivalent of John Lynch. And that has a long history of, in New Hampshire, in terms of the governorship being seen as less partisan than candidates for federal office, right? Executives of New Hampshire, in some ways, they're like, I forget who put it to me, but they're kind of mayors of a town, and a large town, but still they have that nonpartisanship to them. And, Chris Sununu certainly plays that up to the hilt, very much a cheerleader for the state and so forth. And so I think you can see that, that split ticket happening. What I wonder about is whether there's a chance for whether Chris Sununu points the way forward for New Hampshire Republicans. Like if they ran more candidates for federal office who were like Chris Sununu, less Trumpy, less MAGA, and so forth, whether they would have more success is a question to think about.
And have you thought about that question, Professor Scala?
Yeah, I think to some extent, yeah, I think it's, what's interesting is whether, it was striking how such a popular Republican governor had so little success in persuading fellow partisans about what candidates to choose. And it just showed the real limits of party leadership these days, even for someone like, Chris Sununu, the most popular Republican in the state. His endorsements didn't matter a whole lot in Republican primaries. And so you've got a sense where, you have, again, party elites versus the party base. And are Republicans in a place yet where they're ready to move on? We're still waiting to see.
A couple things with governors. It's not unusual that governors do differently or kind of independent actors in their states compared with federal offices in particular. Because the governor, you can see actual results. You can see how they administer an organization. They're kind of they're the CEOs of a big organization already. And you can see that they tend to be, because they're CEOs, they tend to be less partisan, less dramatic than say somebody who's in Congress or the Senate in particular, whose job it is, frankly, to talk and persuade people rather than to administer. And you can see, like, Georgia is another good example of where a Republican governor, kind of more of a bland Republican governor, Kemp, wins big in a state that Democrats win that very controversial Senate election. So this is not, I think, an unusual thing. The governors are somewhat different, separated from the national political scene. But to Dante's point about the kind of candidates that are winning and endorsements, I've talked with a lot of politicos about the weight of endorsements in New Hampshire, and they generally say that they don't really have that much because nobody really has a political machine other than the Democratic Party itself. There is no political machine in New Hampshire. If you're elected to the state Senate, you don't have any money, you don't have any appointment ability, you don't have the sort of power that you would if you were in a state like Massachusetts. So I think that just the ability for elected officials to sway voters' minds is very much reduced here than it is in other places. They just don't have the organizations.
Got it. Thank you. I don't want to get us too far ahead. There were a couple questions related to that independent and undeclared issue we were talking about earlier. So let me hit on them quickly and get your take on them. So first, can you talk about the party or issues typically connected with the independent voters? And I don't know if you could talk about that both in relation to those registered independents and those potentially undeclared, and if that even plays out in a certain way. And then the other question related to that, is there a specific party that those voters tend to vote for on a regular basis? So I don't know if that works better for you, Andy, potentially.
Yeah, in our polling that we've seen over the years, if you take those people in from polling who say they're registered undeclared, and then you ask them their partisanship. The plurality lean Democratic. It's not huge. It's about 35% or so of them are really Democrats. About 30% of those undeclareds are really Republicans, and the rest are truly independent. And it's also really important to remember that those undeclareds are significantly less likely to vote than are registered Democrats or registered Republicans. And I guess the way to look at it is, in particular, those people that are truly independents in the middle, they're like people who you ask them what's their favorite baseball team, and if they're going to go to a baseball game, but they really don't care about baseball. They like football instead. They may be like football fans who will watch the Super Bowl, but that's it. So those people are just not as engaged in politics as are the registered Democrats and Republicans.
Got it. Thanks. There are a couple more questions online that we'll get to in a second. Could you guys talk a little bit about the results in our state legislature? So we'll take a break from kind of these federal and gubernatorial issues, and we're now looking at a near equal split in the New Hampshire House. The Dems picked up a number of seats in the Senate. Could you kind of just give us your sense of what happened there, and what are the implications of that for our state for the next couple of years here?
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind how those races which are down ballot are so much at the mercy of what happens at the top of the ballot. One thing we pride ourselves in New Hampshire on is, our close relationship with our state legislators, because there are so many of them, they represent so few people, and so forth. But there's a lot that undermines that mythical relationship. And one of those is that a lot of New Hampshire voters are new to New Hampshire. Andy and I have done work over the years with our friend and colleague Ken Johnson, demographer and Carsey fellow, and we've looked at how much turnover there is in the New Hampshire electorate. And it's always, we've seen this over and over again, but it's always a bit surprising how many New Hampshire voters are new to the electorate, who are just coming in for the first time. And so you think about, again, that relationship with the state legislator, how many voters actually know who these people are at the bottom of the ticket. And so they're really kind of at the mercy of what's happening up ticket, things like, is one side turning out more than the other? Because these state legislative candidates aren't, they're even the ones who try really hard. It's tough to influence their race from the bottom up. And so you look at the results, again, I was a bit gloomy going into election day about Democratic prospects, and that included down ticket. And so Democrats held up, the fact that Democrats gained seats was a surprise. And but it just went to show just kind of how well Democrats performed up and down, except for the governorship, but the rest of the races, they had them well in hand, and that translated down ballot.
Yeah, so the thing about the down ballot, we've asked, again, in polling, we've asked people if they can name who their state their congressman is, their U.S. congressman. Only about 40% of people in New Hampshire and across the country can name their congressman. You get down to a state senator, only about 20% can name their state senator, and only about 8% are even willing to guess at the name of one of their state representatives. So we do have this myth that because we have so many state representatives, everybody knows them. Truth is, almost nobody knows who any of their state representatives are. So they vote for candidate R or candidate D. And when you look at the composition of the legislature itself, it's always good to win elections in years ending with 0, because that gives you the ability to draw lines. And Republicans for the last 3 cycles, going back to 2000, which is in the competitive world of today, have won those legislative elections, won control of the House and the Senate, draw the lines, and they've done a very good job of gerrymandering, particularly the state Senate lines, not so much the House, in such a way that it takes about 54% of the popular vote to win majorities in those legislative bodies, particularly in the Senate. And so it's going to be very hard. And some of that is simply because where the people are. Democratic voters tend to be concentrated more in the larger cities or the bigger towns, the college towns, whereas Republicans tend to be spread more evenly across the state. So it's easier for Republicans to pack those Democrats into smaller districts. But at the state Senate, it is closer, and you can see that the Democrats, a few thousand votes here or there, would have won control of the state house, which is more indicative of the overall vote pattern in the state. This election.
So there's actually a question from one of our audience members related to this, and both of you touched on it. But when you look at, this idea of gerrymandering and the fact that, districts are drawn by one particular party, you look at what happened, in this past election, any real surprises there? Dante, you had mentioned that you were surprised by how many seats the Dems were able to pick up. Any races in particular or anything that you just looked and based on what you would have, presumed based on how the districts were drawn, and what you've seen historically just really took you by surprise?
I guess you have one example. I think the open seat that Tom Sherman left behind to run for governor, which was an open seat. You had a Republican who was very well self-financed and so forth. I thought Republicans had a real chance at picking up that seat and taking it from the Democrats. And yet the Democrat did very well. It didn't turn out to be very close at all. And that was kind of indicative of how the whole evening went. Like, I went into the evening on election day thinking, wow, this could be really a number of tight races and so forth. I wonder how late I'll be up. And I was up late anyway, but I wasn't up late watching New Hampshire returns because it was pretty clear an hour in how things were going to go.
I wasn't particularly surprised at any of the races coming through. Once you saw how the overall trend was going, I agree with Dante. It was going to an early night for New Hampshire.
Great, thank you. There are a bunch of questions coming in related to free state movement, free staters. Are you guys seeing any effect that free state movement's having on our politics, our elections? Is this something that you guys have thought about and any insight in that space?
I'd say separate politics and elections. In politics, they're having, I think, an important thing. They've been doing what New Hampshire enables people to do, and that is to run in local elections and for the state house and get elected there. So they've gotten themselves elected in a number of positions in school boards and select boards, zoning boards, and in the state legislature to a degree that's what civic engagement is supposed to be. But in elections, not much support, not much at all. There really aren't that many. I think if you look at their website, they're claiming 6,000 to 8,000 people have moved in. Well, 6,000 to 8,000 people in an electorate of this last time around of over 600,000 people is a drop in the bucket. And it's not enough to significantly influence elections really one way or another, unless you get down to very, very localized elections. So I think that in politics, they are having an impact, and actually winning elections, not so much.
Yeah, it just goes to show, right? You have very low barriers to entry in New Hampshire politics, especially at the the lower levels, town levels, state legislative levels. So groups potentially can bat above their demographic weight, so to speak. And I think we've seen evidence of that happening in the state legislature, and as Andy said, at the local level as well. I don't know that free staters will ever get to that number that they set out as their goal for migration. That goes all the way back to the early 2000s, and yet they've had an impact. Democrats always are talking about the menace of free staters and so forth, and so they get a lot of mileage out of it as well.
Thanks, guys, and we're going to come back to New Hampshire in a few minutes, but I want to pull you out and kind of think about the bigger picture. Just thinking about the results across the country. And Dante, maybe we'll start with you on this. Anything that really took you by surprise looking at the map?
I mean, looking back, I mean, there were two schools of thought about how things were going to turn out. One was that this would be a typical midterm for the party in power, i.e., would be bad news for the party in power. You had inflation, gas prices, unpopular president, all of that led one school of thought to say, well, it's going to be a bad year. And then the other school of thought was, no, well, there are countervailing forces. There's the overturn of Roe v. Wade, which threw a wrench into the whole idea of the midterm being a referendum purely on the party in power. And then you had Donald Trump, who, even though a former president, was still very active, very prominent in American politics. And it turned out that I think the latter school of thought was correct. I think if you had offered me a wager that every incumbent U.S. senator would be reelected back in September, you would have made a great deal of money off of me. I think, every incumbent, really? So it was striking how we live in this time that's so tumultuous. And I saw this on reading through Twitter the other day. I guess, is it the case, it's an interesting theory, that is it the case that because we're living in this very uncertain time, that there turned out to be this rush to safety, i.e. familiar faces, incumbents. And so despite the fact that a lot of people are unhappy with the direction of the country, did that make them more likely to re-elect incumbents? And I think you could see that play out with Maggie Hassan and Don Bolduc. I mean, how much of Maggie Hassan's messaging was, hey, you know me, you don't know that guy. You don't know what that guy's going to do. And you may not be thrilled with me, but at least you know who I am.
Yeah, I mean, said like a true political scientist, I think. The question is do we need that theory that, we're running back to safety, or is this just the way that it is, right? That incumbency makes it easier to win elections, and that, for the most part, has been part of, electoral politics, since we've been electing people, right? I mean, you raise more money, the effect of outsiders trying to come in, has been challenging. The barriers of entry are higher, and New Hampshire might be an outlier in that space. But is this just what we've always seen? Is it just the same with a kind of different storyline around it? Incumbency is hard to beat.
I'd say yes, but I think look at it from a slightly different angle. One of the things that we definitely have seen over the last 30 years is the homogenization of the political parties on an ideological spectrum, that we now have a center progressive Democratic Party and a center conservative Republican Party. And I should say conservative drifting to the center and liberal drifting to the center. There aren't that many people in the middle of politics anymore. And so the key thing for me to look at with elections isn't which candidate are you going to vote for, it's who shows up, which party is able to drive their people to the polls, because once they get there, they pretty much vote just for their candidates. With that, I think that odd exception of governors, people are rooting for their teams. The matter, in my mind, that the metaphor would be, is my team playing well enough that I need to buy a ticket this year, to buy a ticket to the game? And if you think your team is, then you go buy a ticket and you go to the game and you vote. And if you think your team's a bunch of bums, you stay home, or you're more likely to stay home. But you're not going to root for the other team. You're not going to cross over and vote for the other party. So I don't know if it's so much, I think it's more that the Democrats were able to motivate their voters to come out and vote, to go to the game in a year when they would be more likely to stay home given the economic environment. And they did that by pushing those two issues, stop Donald Trump and MAGA, and the abortion issue. And I was in several states and observing in several states as well, and looking at the campaign advertisements that were coming out. They were virtually identical to the campaign advertisements coming out from Democrats in New Hampshire. Same issues, the same message. Swap the names and the photos on the ads, and they would be the same thing.
Dante, thinking about kind of staying at this national picture, any states that you see might be a bellwether for what we're looking for in 2024?
I mean, I think, if you're Joe Biden looking at 2024, and he is, you're looking at Ohio and Florida, and you're crossing them off your list. In Ohio, you had Tim Ryan, really an ideal Democrat running in Ohio, working class Democrat, kind of a throwback Democrat, ran a very good campaign against not a very good candidate in J.D. Vance, and yet Ohio went for the Republican because that's where Ohio is now. And then Florida, same story. I mean, Florida was that rare good news for Republicans. So I think if you're Biden, you're looking at, you're crossing those two off. You're saying Arizona, Georgia, and then the Midwestern states, right? You got Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. You've got that the road to re-election goes through those states. And so I think if you were tired of hearing about Maricopa County and ballot counting, I've got bad news for you, because I think you're going to hear Arizona is going to be front and center in 2024, not just because of Kristen Sinema, because that will be clearly a battleground state. Where will we be? We'll be, where we've been, which is part of the first cut of swing states, but we're not dead center the way perhaps we were back in 2000. We're now more kind of along with, say, Minnesota, right? We're a Democratic leaning swing state that could fall off the board as we get closer to November.
Do you put a North Carolina on your map as something to watch, or is it not quite there yet?
I think if you're Democrats, you've got to be looking to try to, you had success in Georgia. I think you have to, with Florida out of play, then I think you have to look at North Carolina as a prospect that you have to cultivate, even if you don't win.
Yeah, and the states I look at are the states that have had significant migration from largely Democrats into those areas. North Carolina and the Research Triangle has gotten to be heavily Democratic in those areas. Arizona has become Democratic because of migration from California, as well as second generation Hispanics who are now old enough to vote and have been voting Democratic. Georgia, migration as well into the Atlanta area, and the people in that area are largely Democratic. So people don't lose. We tend to think of states as fixed bodies, and we think of electorates as a thing rather than a constantly changing mass of people. And they tend not to show up. We tend not to see or pay attention to the differences until the elections switch at the very top. But you can see the trends that have gone on in these other states. They've been becoming increasingly Democratic over time. I would throw Virginia in as another example of that, of people moving out of the DC area into Northern Virginia. We tend not to recognize it until the seats flip, whereas that slower process of migration changing what the electorate looks like has been going on for some time. Now, it's like VOK would call that a secular realignment, meaning that the people have changed, not the, but as I think in journalistic world, we're always looking for the idea that's making people vote one way or the other. And it's really not an issue of ideas. It's an issue of who the people are underneath that are actually doing the voting.
And I think, Andy, you can see that happening here as well in New Hampshire. Again, referring back to our work with Ken Johnson, because people who are new to the state, right, moving the state, who tend to be more liberal, more Democratic, and so forth. Look up and down Interstate 93 at the results in those towns up and down. Once upon a time, when we first moved here, Bedford, New Hampshire, was as Republican a place as you could imagine in the state of New Hampshire. And now Joe Biden carried Bedford. Right? Maggie Hassan carried the town of Bedford. You see a lot of those places. And again, it's, I think part of the explanation is migration and turnover in those places as new people move in and old people, either, move away.
Or move to Florida.
Yeah, they're really great points. And I appreciate you guys bringing these up, because these are not the things that, people are typically thinking about. And for all of those folks, still listening right now, I think what we'll do is, when we thank you for your attendance, we can link to one of those briefs that Dante is referring to, related to some of the work that Dante, Andy, and Ken have done, because there are connections here that you could dig a little bit deeper on. So thanks for bringing that out. So the question that we keep getting hit with on the chat board, question people are interested in, any reactions to the Democratic National Committee changes in the primary schedule? What are we thinking about as far as our first in the nation status? Just any thoughts, any reactions? So I'll leave it to the two of you. Andy, why don't we start with you, then we'll go to Dante.
Well, New Hampshire will still be the first in the nation primary, because we have a law that requires it that happen. New Hampshire's never been important because of the number of delegates that we elect, or really anything special about our electorate. It's been important because people paid attention to it. Both candidates and the media paid attention to it, and candidates got momentum because of the tremendous media attention they got out of winning New Hampshire. If candidates don't show up because they don't think it's important, or because they think they're going to be sanctioned by their party on the Democratic side, it's not going to be as important there. On the Republican side, it's still going to be the first primary, and it's going to go on like it has in the past. So I don't think it's going to go away. It's going to be different. I'm curious to see if there will be any back down upon by Democrats to do this. But to me, there's one other thing about this, is that it's really an opportunity for the Democratic Party to centralize its role in choosing who its nominee is. Because one of the other things that it says, not only putting New Hampshire second, but it's requiring any early state to have early voting as well, because Democrats have been doing very well in early voting in their general elections. And that's not something that New Hampshire has. So I think it's another way to really shove New Hampshire out of the way, to disqualify it, because that it is a state in which they can't guarantee that a candidate like a Joe Biden, for example, who's the party's ideal candidate to win. They can't make sure that he could win in a state like this. And parties exist to choose candidates who can win presidential elections. And that's their major part, their major job. And they want to control it.
Yeah, this is the most significant challenge to the status of the New Hampshire primary since the modern nomination process began in 1972. And it does come from one party, not from both, as Andy pointed out. But the fact that you have President Biden himself, the leader of the Democratic Party, weighing in on what the calendar should look like, that's something new that's on the table. And also, and I think this has been brewing for a few decades now, it was one thing when New Hampshire was squabbling with another state about who goes first. And when it was one state versus another, New Hampshire could win those battles thanks to its first in the nation law and so forth. But now, New Hampshire is fighting against a principle, right, in the Democratic Party, which is the principle that Biden laid out, that we are a multiracial party. Voters of color should be front and center in our process. So now New Hampshire, in trying to protect a status, is kind of fighting against, in order to do so, is contravening that principle of diversity. And you hear a lot of Democratic Party elites nationwide now making that case about who should go first and so forth. And so I think Andy put his finger on it. We'll go first, but it's very possible that in 2024, it'll be business as usual on the Republican side, but on the Democratic side, it could very well be the case that Joe Biden doesn't come up to New Hampshire and pay to put his name on the ballot, right? So Democrats may have, on paper, there'll be a primary, but will vote, if candidates don't show up, if no one challenges Biden and Biden doesn't show up, well, the media is not going to cover that. And if the media doesn't cover that, are Democrats in New Hampshire even going to pay attention?
Yeah, and one of the things that I found in our polling that's interesting that relates to what Dante said is that Democrats are now less supportive of New Hampshire having the first presidential primary than they ever been. And they're less supportive of it than both Republicans and independents in the state. So even Democrats here in New Hampshire, only 45% of Democrats currently say they support the law having requiring New Hampshire to have the first in the nation primary. So they're hearing the same message that the national party has. And if the voters in the Democratic Party aren't going to be used kind of as a threat, there'd be a whole lot of Democrats would be upset and maybe would vote against their party in subsequent elections, then there's really no downside for Democrats to push that here in New Hampshire.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. That really insightful. This is kind of one of those we'll wait and see, right? We'll have to just see what happens and how this plays out. I just want to thank both Dante Scala and Andy Smith for joining us this morning. We really appreciate your time. We know that you guys are on top of this, and getting your insight is just super helpful for us and for our audience. For all of our audience out there, we really thank you for coming out today and listening to these two political scientists talk about this. Just a reminder and a plug, we'll be doing this next month on January 11th. We're going to have with us Brian Gottlieb, who's the director of the New Hampshire Economic and Labor Market Information Bureau. So looking forward to that talk. We'd encourage you all to join us, and we'll hopefully keep this conversation going. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next month. Take care.